Welcome, everyone, and happy and healthy new year. We are continuing our studies. We're in the section of Jewish literacy. It's about history, and there is a lot of history that we'll be discussing today. But the main thing that I want to focus on today is Judaism and Christianity, both the history of how Christianity gets started, but obviously I also want to talk about a lot of similarities and differences in this area. So we're off, and as always, I want to acknowledge my support from the local Jewish Federation. Keep an eye on admitting people. And also mention, we do have one or two new people who may not be so familiar with my website. Got a website, lotker.com. If you go to classes, and then on the classes page, there's a lot of material. And then I have a separate page set up for Jewish literacy. And basically, the copies of the PDFs, or PDF copies of my slides, and also the videos for these classes. Okay, so the subject this evening is Judaism and Christianity. And it's important to talk about Judaism and Christianity. It's certainly important for Jews to talk about Judaism and Christianity, because whether you like it or not, we live in a Christian world. We all have Christian friends. Many have Christian relatives. Many have Christian spouses. And the big change in the last, I would say, 100 years or so, maybe 70 years, is that by and large, the Christians don't hate us. They often love us. And that's a new problem for Jews and the Jewish world. We know very well, historically, through the history of, say, 1,500 years, how do we live alongside folks that hate us? We haven't quite figured out how do we live and still maintain our integrity alongside a world that accepts us and loves us. How to relate to Christians and Christianity is perhaps the most common religious question Jews face these days. I know Jews, friends of mine, whose most passionate Jewish activity is fighting Christmas programs at schools and making sure Hanukkah gets equal time. So, you know, we live in this world. I believe we have a brief window to lock in peace and understanding. And I believe this is a result of the Holocaust. The Holocaust basically unleashed, and the session next week is about the Holocaust. The Holocaust basically unleashed an example of what happens when anti-Semitism reaches its logical conclusion. And I would say the aftermath of that was most, not all, Christian churches shocked into realizing what happened, and also understanding that had Jesus been around, you know, in Europe, he would have joined his fellow Jews in gas chambers. And so Christianity dramatically changed its perspective on Judaism. We're going to talk more about that, and that's a huge change. The question is whether 100 years from now we will still be in this world, or whether, you know, we'll move on and go back to the bad old days. We need honest dialogue and understanding between Judaism and Christianity. I speak lots to Jews and lots to Christians, and it's very tempting when I'm in a Jewish group to compare the best of Judaism with the worst in Christianity, or I'm not sure if this is, or what we think is the worst in Christianity. So people have their ideas about what's involved in another religion, and without really understanding it. So it's important to be honest, and important to, you know, to have knowledgeable proponents or representatives on both sides. It's why I so love speaking about Christianity with Christian scholars. And, you know, I guess the next bullet there, it's tempting to compare what we know about Judaism to what we misunderstand about Christianity. So interfaith dialogue is a passion of mine, as I think most of you know. So I want to talk about some basics of Christianity. Christianity is based on Jewish ideas. The concept of Messiah is a Jewish idea. In Judaism, in biblical Judaism, if you've sinned, or if you're feeling good and you want to offer up thanks to God, you basically participate in an animal sacrifice, or a sacrifice of sometimes grains, sometimes liquids. But basically, if you're going to connect with God in biblical Judaism, you go to the temple in Jerusalem, you get yourself a priest as an intermediary between you and God, and you participate in some kind of sacrifice. So the idea that Jesus is a sacrifice is very much based on a Jewish biblical idea of sacrifice being what you do when you're concerned with the problem of sin. The idea of salvation, of grace, all are Jewish ideas which are changed as they get applied in Christianity. I have one of those books behind me. I think it's called something like a dictionary of the Jewish Christian dialogue. And one of the really interesting things is concepts like sin, salvation, grace mean something very different in Judaism than they have come to be understood to mean in Christianity. The role of a priest as an intermediary, as I mentioned, is a Jewish idea. I often, when I'm working with Jews who are in recovery, it's very common in 12-step programs to recite the Lord's Prayer. And people will ask me, is it okay to say that prayer as a Jew? And there is nothing not Jewish about the Lord's Prayer. The only thing that is not Jewish in the Lord's Prayer is the name, because when it's Jesus' prayer. So when they call it the Lord's Prayer, they're referring to Jesus as Lord. But the entire content of the prayer is very Jewish. Praying for God's kingdom, our Father who art in heaven, all of those things, very Jewish. Also, I want to emphasize, as a Jew, Christianity is an astoundingly beautiful idea. The idea of God becoming human to endure the pain that we endure alongside of us is a beautiful idea. Most of Jesus' teachings are fundamentally Jewish. And of course, people get hung up with the Trinity and will often say, well, the Trinity, proves that Christianity is really not monotheistic because it talks about three gods. I would say normative Christianity's understanding of God is monotheistic, one God relating to the earth in three very different ways. And, I say, don't let this hang you up. I am a brother, I am a son, I am a father, I'm a grandfather, I'm a friend, I'm a teacher, I'm a student. I relate to different elements in the world in a very different way. And by the way, in Kabbalah, we had a session on Kabbalah, classes on Kabbalah. There is an understanding of the tenfold nature of God. Yeah, Bryce.
Yeah, I just wonder why the Christians are so hung up on God being a Trinity. And
that's the definition of Christianity.
Well, what I mean is, I'm just wondering how that came to be. I guess, yeah.
It's a great question. Actually, I don't know the answer as to how that came to be. I do know that in the early days of Christianity, there was a debate about whether Jesus was fully God, fully human, only human, or both God and human. So that was a debate and was settled at a council in Nicaea. The interesting thing about Christianity is they developed a structure for settling those arguments and deciding, here's what you should believe, and the rest of it is heresy. So that's actually, I'd say, part of Christian nature. And we're going to get into that Christianity is so focused on proper belief rather than proper action. So I've talked a lot about the Jewish concept of Messiah. Just to go over it briefly, the English word Messiah is a translation of the Hebrew word Mashiach. Mashiach means anointed. In ancient times, the kings of Israel, when they became king, they had holy oil poured on their head, either by a prophet or a priest, and they were said to be anointed, which is Mashiach. There are 35 39, times that the word Mashiach is mentioned in the Hebrew Bible. And generally speaking, they're talking about kings of Israel. One king, Cyrus of Persia, is also called Mashiach. But not one of these references is to a future redeemer. When the Hebrew Bible is translated into Greek, this is a Jewish translation in about the year 200 before the Common Era. So it is not a Christian translation. It's a Jewish translation for Jews who were speaking Greek. The Hebrew word Mashiach is translated into the Greek word Christos. And of course, the Greek word Christos gives rise to the English word Christ, which is why when I'm talking about Jesus, I'm very careful to use the term Jesus and not to use the term Christ, unless I'm making a specific theological point, saying that Christians believe that Jesus is the Christ. Christ basically is a word meaning the same thing as Messiah. So some basics about Christianity. The time of Jesus was a very troubled time. It was a time of Roman oppression. It was a time when, you have the Maccabees in about 150, 160 years before the time of Jesus. The successor kings to the Maccabees were, I would say, largely corrupt. They had succession problems, and they invited the Romans in to help them with those problems, and the Romans were only too happy to come in and to stay. So there was a lot of anti-Roman sentiment. There were a lot of different Jewish groups arising, and Jesus was involved in one of those groups. It was a time of great messianic expectation, just like Fiddler on the Roof, with the people in the Vanatevka asking, wouldn't this be a good time for the Messiah to come? Jesus is understood, I would say, certainly by me and by scholars, as being a real historical figure. Occasionally, I will, run into somebody who has a huge problem with this idea. I don't know any serious scholar who denies that Jesus was a real person. Really, what we know about Jesus, we know from the New Testament. Traveling preacher, faith healer, called rabbi in the New Testament. Not clear whether that term was actually used around the time of Jesus, but it certainly was used shortly thereafter. So rabbi meaning my teacher. Executed by the Romans about the year 33 during Passover. And all of the early Christians are Jews. So in the first century, if you were a Christian, I'm not sure that term was used at all. To be a Christian, you would be a Jew. Christianity was one Jewish movement. I'll call on you in a second, Michael. Paul's great invention is that you don't have to be Jewish to be Christian.
Yeah.
So it almost sounds silly, but in those days, to be a Christian, you would have to be Jewish. It's like saying, can I be a Reformed Jew without being Jewish? The answer is no. To be Christian, to be a follower of Jesus, you would have to be Jewish. Paul's genius is that he really creates a Christianity that doesn't insist that you're Jewish first. And also obviously has a lot of other issues, and he's wildly successful. The Christian Bible is written approximately 100 years, some as late as 200 years, maybe some of it is a little less than 100 years after the time of Jesus. So, and the key event in Christian history, I would say, other than obviously Jesus' life, is Roman Emperor Constantine's conversion in the 4th century. Michael, you had a question. You are muted. Yeah.
Yes. Just more of a comment, I guess. I know that you did mention that our only record, I guess, of Jesus having been in existence was in the New Testament, but I believe that there were artifacts and other memoirs discovered at Masada, who wrote of an individual who exactly resembled someone of Jesus, born in about the same time as Jesus. So I just wanted to
and there's also Josephus, in Josephus' books, Jesus is mentioned, but it's not clear. At least some of the writings in Josephus seems to be an after the fact addition. And there are some archaeological inscriptions, I would say, which are controversial. But the details of Jesus' life, you know, his birth, his ministry, and so on, what we know of them, really, we know from the New Testament. Okay, more about Christianity. Basic Christian theology, and those of you who have been attending this have heard me say this time and time again. There are 43,000 different Christian movements, and they all differ typically on articles of faith. So everything I'm going to say about Christianity is an oversimplification, will apply to some, but certainly not all. But basic Christian theology, as I understand it, is we are all born into sin from the Garden of Eden. Adam and Eve's eating of the fruit becomes an original sin that stains humankind. And the understanding from a Christian perspective is Torah and doing mitzvot, fulfilling commandments, is not really a help because there's so many laws. I mean, as I hope you've heard me say before, in the Torah, we Jews count 613 commandments, and the rabbis who are active around this time are mandating thousands more. So from a Christian point, from the Christian theology, we got a big problem. The big problem is original sin, and oh, by the way, our sinful nature. A Jewish response is obey Torah. The Christian response to the Jewish response is there's too many rules. We can't get them all right. And as we understand this, and some of this has to do with the Greek translation, if we screw up once, we might as well have screwed up all of them. So it's hopeless. In fact, I don't know if I have the quotes here. The law was given to prove this point to us. So therefore, we need a sacrifice. What else? What else would you do with the problem of sin but have a sacrifice? But in Jewish law, a sacrifice has to be a perfect animal with a limited number of imperfections. You can't just, if you're sacrificing, let's say a sheep, you can't just take the sickliest sheep that you really are not going to miss. You really have to take a perfect animal. What animal, what sacrifice could be more perfect than God become human, and somehow in becoming human, not being tainted by original sin? Jesus' death atones for all the world's sins. If you've been paying attention on Sunday mornings, you've heard this from other folks before me. And also that Jesus' resurrection proves God's victory over death. Faith and acceptance of Jesus is the key to the next world and salvation. And here to me is the important logical argument. This again is a Christian argument. If you could get salvation by good works, what Judaism teaches is first, God is going to judge us. And, scales of justice, we've done some good things, we've done some bad things. We believe God is both just and compassionate. If the folks here could get on God's good side, whatever that means, by virtue of how you live your life, then why did Jesus have to die? If the underlying assumption is Jesus died for everyone's sins, then that death must have been necessary for everyone. So you can't get to heaven based on your actions. And there's a teaching in the New Testament that no one gets to the Father except through the Son, through Jesus. And that's why Christians are determined to make everyone in the world Christian. The way I would say many Christian churches now are approaching this question is sort of two ways of spinning things. One is the understanding that Jews are already in relationship with the Father, namely, we're already in a covenant. God does not break God's covenants, so therefore we don't need another path to be in covenant with God. And the second idea is, yes, Jesus is the gatekeeper, if you will, but Jesus reads our hearts, even though we may reject him as God. So just a couple of comments. Bryce.
Yeah, so quick question. The first one, two questions. One, the first one is that why is there any justification in scripture that the Christians would cite to justify original sin being inherited by everyone and not just some assumption that they pulled out of the air? And two, the faith and acceptance of Jesus, if we could get salvation by good works, that's a tautology. It assumes its own truth to prove itself.
Okay,
so
let me address the first
Yeah.
and the second. Maybe I just didn't state it clearly in the second. In the first, it says, the Hebrew Bible says, when you eat the fruit, you will die. Never mind that they don't actually die. We say death enters the world. So, and the Christian writers say we all come from the same couple and we all inherit that sin. I'm not sure where Christian writings and where Christian theology gets that. And I'm not here to defend it.
Sure, no, I understand. I just thought maybe you might know.
And the second one, I don't understand it as a tautology, except to say that it doesn't surprise me that Jesus is the path to salvation and Jesus only, because if there were other paths, think about it. If I was a Christian and I believed I could get into good relationship with God by one of two ways. Option number one, faith in Jesus. Option number two, live a good life. If I could get into a good relationship with God by living a good life, then Jesus didn't really have to die. We should really just be living good lives, which of course is what I believe. But
Yeah.
If the axiom is Jesus died for everyone, then I believe that teaching follows. Larry.
Thanks. First off, what you're talking about, that last part that you just said, to me goes back to Leviticus chapter 19, verses 18 and 34. More or less, that's the essence of what God supposedly wants, not so much sacrifice and all the other stuff. That was created more for man, in my opinion. My question is, isn't it said in Judaism that one man cannot atone for another man's discretion or sin?
So what I would, yes, I would say that's true.
Yes. Thank you.
And your point is, how can Jesus atone for the sins of the world? So let me, but what it does say in Judaism, biblical Judaism, is the sacrifice of a sheep can atone for your sins.
Well, a man cannot atone for another man's sin in Judaism.
Yes, but
you have to atone for your own sin. You can't have somebody else.
Okay, so let me just point out the idea of atoning for your sins and being forgiven for your sins is a concept that's not mentioned in the Torah. The path in the Torah, if you've sinned, is to sacrifice animals. And I don't know if my neighbor can sacrifice a sheep for me. I actually, since it's the priest that's sacrificing the animal and not me anyway.
Well, that's their job. That's their responsibility to Hashem.
Right. So I don't know the answer in biblical times whether someone else could bring a sacrifice, but essential element of Christianity is Jesus' sacrifice does apply to the world, and surprise, surprise, it's not Jewish. Ryan.
Thanks. Yeah, I was going to say back to the earlier point about multiple ways into heaven. I mean, I think isn't that part of the Reformation and Martin Luther with the indulgences? And I think people were worried that, hey, if you give to the church and you do these things, you can kind of have your sins forgiven. And so there was sort of a backlash of that right. Sort of second door.
Yeah. So what's going on in Christianity is that faith in Jesus takes the place of other commandments and is a path toward forgiveness of sin. And, in normative Christianity, if you've sinned, you go to a priest and you ask the priest, you confess your sins, and the priest grants you absolution. So if the priest can do this, how much more so the Pope? And of course, the corruption comes when it becomes a cash transaction, which the Reformation absolutely is a response to. Let me move along. So again, this continuing with Christian understanding, faith in Jesus is the key. People doing good things are not a ticket into heaven or a ticket into a relationship with God, but a sign that you have established a good relationship with God. From my point of view, I could care less why people do good things. In Judaism, our focus is on what you do, not why you do it, not on the underlying theology. So how much more so am I not concerned with why Christians do good things? You know, a lot of hospitals have Christian names and crosses on the doors and the buildings and so on, and people are doing wonderful, wonderful things for others. And as a Jew, I think it's a mitzvah. But from a Christian perspective, it's not the ticket in, it's not what you're doing here to get into heaven there. It's actually, and again, very different among different Christian groups, a sign that you're in a good relationship with God. The other issue, you know, even more fundamental than the issues that Larry raised, is the prophecies concerning the Messiah have not been fulfilled. In fact, Jesus doesn't fulfill a single prophecy concerning the Messiah. So the Christian response, and so a big one would be world peace. The Christian response to that is that Jesus will come a second time. And in that second coming, you've probably heard of this, Jesus will fulfill those prophecies. That's fine. It's not Jewish. And then the other thing is salvation is about your soul. So if we say a sign of the Messiah is salvation, when Jews say salvation, we're talking about what happens in this world. When Christians say salvation, they're really much more focused on the next world. And that's another general difference between Christianity and Judaism. Christianity is much more focused on the next world and your relationship with God in that world. Judaism is much more focused on this world and our relationship, our doing mitzvot in this world. One or two more thoughts. Christianity changed dramatically in its early years. It begins as a Jewish Jesus is Messiah movement and develops into a Jesus is God, born of a virgin who dies for us movement. The second part of that has a lot to do with Roman pagan religions, and the first is a Jewish, is a variant on Judaism. Michael.
Yes. So could you explain a little bit more about salvation in the Jewish context, about that you do good in this world to better, I guess, in the next world, or is that a concept in Judaism? And if so, I guess, how is there a difference in Christianity at that point? Or,
Yeah,
or
so
that issue?
in Judaism, salvation is Geulah. And the idea is our marching orders, basically fulfilling mitzvot. And, you know, the mystics have different takes on it. Different Jewish movements have different takes on it. I would say in Reform Judaism, the focus is on what is often called tikkun olam, repair of the world, making peace, feeding the hungry, curing disease, and so on. And there's a very important line in the Mishnah that says, don't serve the master for hope of reward, but serve the master for the love of the master. So, and my understanding in Christianity, the focus of controlling yourself in this world is establishing a relationship with God for an eternal life in the next world. That certainly is my understanding. Occasionally, we have people here who are far more knowledgeable in Christianity than I am. So that's...
You got the essence of it right.
Okay, thank you. So what's our response to Christian teaching? We don't accept Jesus as Messiah. I think most of us know that. I remember once at Temple Adat Elohim, my kids coming home from Hebrew school saying we learned about, you know, Christian holidays, and and we understand that Jesus is a prophet. That is not true. That is not the Jewish understanding. I mentioned that Jesus doesn't fulfill prophecies concerning Messiah, such as world peace, one religion, gathering of exiles, end of famine and disease. Christian understanding of Messiah is very different than a Jewish understanding of Messiah. I think that's the title of my chapter in the in my book, Christian's Guide to Judaism. The question that we're addressing is not whether Jesus was the Messiah, but what do we mean by Messiah? Jewish understanding of Messiah is fully human and only human. Christians understand Jesus and Messiah as fully God and fully human. There is no discussion of atonement and forgiveness from sin associated with Jewish concept of Messiah. And there have been lots of false messiahs in history. Some people call them failed messiahs. Bar Kokhba in 132, Shabtai Tzvi in the 1600s, and of course, Jesus. Why don't we accept Jesus as a prophet? There's two reasons. One is Jesus speaks in his own name. In Judaism, the role of the prophet is to be a mouthpiece for God, is to be a telephone. The typical phrase of the Hebrew prophets are Ko Amar Adonai, thus saith Adonai, and then they repeat what God has told them, the message God has told them to deliver. Jesus, in a few places, speaks in his own name, specifically in the Beatitudes, the Sermon on the Mount. You'll hear a lot of phrases like, others have told you this, 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 and this, but I tell you, and in some of those, Jesus goes further than Jewish teaching. And also, I mean, I think it would be naive to ignore the fact that by the time that the Jesus movement is taking hold and the Roman Empire is becoming Christian, Jesus is the main guy of a religion that is harassing the Jews of the Talmud. So there is no way we are going to have a lot of nice things to say about the main guy of that religion. Just finish this slide. I mentioned before, a Jewish focus is on this world, Christianity on next. Jewish focus is on actions, mitzvot, Christianity on faith. God is quoted actually in the Jerusalem Talmud as saying, better the Jews abandon me, but obey my laws, with the understanding that by obeying God's laws, we become more attached ultimately to God. Larry. You're muted, Larry.
Sorry about that. Most people prefer me that way. Going back to the thing about Jesus's divinity, Nice in 825 to 325 to 285. They discussed it back and forth and all that. Some of the aspect of Rome is that these priests that ended up working for this church were priests that came from the different pagan temples. And in the process of doing that, they already had in mind about pharaohs and kings being gods on earth.
Mm-hmm.
So if somebody is talking about a Jewish king, which they put on his cross, the king of the Jews,
Mm-hmm.
then they took that and embellished it to make it even he is a god on earth like kings and pharaohs. He's the Jewish God on
King of,
earth.
yes, I absolutely agree with that. And again, Christianity is a mix of Jewish ideas and Roman pagan ideas. There's a very good book by Michael Cook on that subject. I think it's called Jewish Understanding of the Gospels. More about our response. Another huge difference between Judaism and Christianity is in the subject of sin and forgiveness, and Larry sort of started mentioning this. In Jewish thought, and you for sins against God, we trust and believe that God is both just and merciful. And if we're sincerely sorry for sins against God, such as violating the Sabbath, not eating non-kosher food, blasphemy, and so on, that if we're sincerely repentant, we believe that God will forgive us. And we have a day, Yom Kippur, set aside for working on that especially hard. For sins against people, we are taught over and over again on Yom Kippur that God cannot forgive, and the interesting word here is cannot, or maybe will not. I guess there's not a big difference. But God does not forgive sins that you commit against another person until you have taken a couple of steps. You've approached the person, asked for forgiveness after having tried sincerely to undo the consequences of your harm against that person, and then received forgiveness from the person. You know, what happens if the person won't forgive you? You're required to do that sincerely 3 times. And there's, you know, the best example of this is a book written by Simon Wiesenthal, the famous Nazi hunter, called The Sunflower. And in that book, Wiesenthal describes an experience he had in a concentration camp, not in the camp. He was a slave laborer working in a hospital, and he was called to the bedside of a dying Nazi soldier. And the Nazi soldier described to him the horrible things he had done to murder Jews. And the Nazi soldier was dying, and he thought that they had done their job, that they had eliminated all the Jews of the world. And the Nazi soldier was surprised to find that there was still a Jew alive, and so asked Wiesenthal to forgive him for his sins, crimes against the Jews, and also to take a message to the soldier's mother. Wiesenthal walks out of the room without forgiving him at all. That's the first half of the book. The second half of the book is Wiesenthal shares this story with thinkers of the time. And I think this is in the 1960s. I should double check that. And the interesting result is every Christian thinker believes that Wiesenthal asks the thinkers, did I do the right thing? Every Christian thinker says, no, you should have forgiven the Nazi. And every Jewish thinker, from the most traditional Orthodox to the most liberal Reform, says, no, you had no right to forgive him because he didn't sin against you. He sinned against other people. So that's a huge difference between Judaism and Christianity. Bryce is asking, is it related to the 3 times? Not to my knowledge. Another huge difference has to do with spirituality and materialism. Christians adopt the Greek idea and ideal of separation. Monks, nuns separating themselves. So body and soul. The idea is to emphasize the spiritual and suppress the physical, suppress the body. Judaism sees body and soul as friends, even lovers. And one of my favorite rabbinic teachings is that when we meet God, we'll be asked by God why we didn't enjoy all the legitimate pleasures of life. Regarding sexuality, Paul, my understanding is Paul expected Jesus' return from heaven, the ushering in the kingdom, any day, and efforts related to men and women chasing each other and having sexual relations with each other were really a waste of time and energy. And so that's what you see in his writings, understanding that Jesus seems to be delayed. And so there's a concession that, well, if you're going to have sex, at least have it with your spouse. But sexuality is diminished and downplayed in Christianity, and is not downplayed at all. Well, I shouldn't say that. Having now read much deeper on that, I would say the normative mainstream in Judaism is to openly embrace the pleasures of life, including sexuality for its own sake, not simply for the sake of having children. The Song of Songs, which is a book in the Hebrew Bible, Christian Bible as well, is really erotic love poetry. And of course, it gets interpreted, the eros gets interpreted out as by the interpreters, saying that it's an allegory on the Jewish side between the love of God and Israel. In Christianity, obviously between Jesus and the church and so on. But but in that book, they're talking about the lover's lips and breasts and hair, and it is erotic love poetry. So we have a text in Christianity, the New Testament. The name can be problematic because the word testament is understood as covenant. And this is really, again, at the heart of Christianity. At the heart of Christianity is God had a covenant with the Jews. Because of the Jews' sins, the covenant is broken. And it's superseded by a new covenant between God and the new Israel, which is understood to be Christianity. And I would say that's pretty much a normative Christian teaching until the aftermath of the Holocaust. And if the only thing you know about Judaism is the Hebrew Bible, and you read the Hebrew Bible carefully, which Christians clearly are doing. And by the way, Larry talked about the Council of Nicaea. One of the other things that was discussed at Nicaea is, do they include the Hebrew Bible as part of Christian sacred scripture? And there were movements to not include the Hebrew Bible, but ultimately it's included. But if you're trying to understand what is Judaism, and the only text I have is the Hebrew Bible, Judaism clearly seems like a dead religion, because it's a religion that revolves around animal sacrifice with a Jewish priesthood at the temple in Jerusalem. And here we are, post-Jesus, there's no Jewish priesthood, there's no temple in Jerusalem. Judaism, from that perspective, is a religion without a basis. I think I commented, I'm not sure if it's this group or others, when I first set about thinking about writing my book for Christians about Judaism, I went to Christian bookstores and bought books that I could find at Christian bookstores about Judaism. And by and large, they were either poor or even offensive. And the ones that I would consider offensive would be the ones that espouse the point that I just made. Basically, the understanding from Christian point of view is Judaism is a religion without a soul, without a heart, and without even a way of worshiping God for the last 2,000 years. What they didn't know, of course, in the world of Christianity, is that we have the Talmud. And we've had classes, other sessions about Mishnah and Talmud, but that then becomes the heart of Judaism. Christianity, my sense of this is that Christianity doesn't really appreciate what the Talmud is for several hundred years. And when they do, we have mass burnings of the Talmud around 1,000 years ago. And this is tragic beyond belief, because remember, there was no printing press. So thousands of copies of the Talmud are burned, and every one of them, was a handwritten document. In fact, there are some elements of Talmud that we are pretty sure existed, but we don't have any texts. And the only way we have suspicions that they existed is we have commentaries on the Talmud from this time period. And we don't have the text on which the commentators are commenting. And so we presume that it exists. And there are scholars that try and recreate what that text must have been. The New Testament is written during a time of maximum competition between Jews and Christians. And this is why I believe anti-Semitism creeps in. So in Matthew, when Pontius Pilate is trying to decide whether or not to execute Jesus or another criminal named Barabbas, and by the way, Bar meaning son, Abba is the father, the son of the father. Interesting take on that name if you know Aramaic. The Jews say crucify, basically they say crucify Jesus, and Pilate famously washes his hands of that decision. And the Jews add, let his death be on us and our children. In other places, Jews are called by Jesus children of the devil. And of course, the accusation of deicide that the Jews killed Jesus is rampant in the New Testament. Why? Because remember what's going on in this early period of Christianity, this new religion, which quickly becomes Gentile. In the first century, Christianity is an offshoot of Judaism. It's a Jewish movement. What happens in the latter part of the first century is the Great Revolt from 66 to 70. And it's a very powerful revolt against Rome, and the Romans are not pleased with the Jews. 60 years later, there's the Bar Kokhba revolt. The Romans are even more upset with the Jews. So if you want to appeal to Rome, buy into our religion, you're not going to be very anxious to say, you know us, we're Jews. No, you're going to try and distinguish yourself from Jews. So the polemical aspects of the New Testament are really focused on distinguishing Jews and Judaism from Christianity. And some scholars believe that one of the reasons why the Christian day of worship is Sunday rather than Saturday, the classic reason is Sunday is the Lord's Day. It's the day of Jesus' resurrection, namely Easter Sunday. But I read another scholarly article that said that the Romans were heavily taxing and abusing synagogues during this time, and the Christians wanted to prove that they're not Jewish synagogues. So instead of a day of worship on Saturday, they shifted it to Sunday. Jerry is asking, when did the New Testament reach its current form? I'm pretty sure it was before Nicaea, or maybe Nicaea does that. So that's in the 4th century, but I'm not certain on the answer to that. Larry, you're muted. Larry, you have your hand up, or you're muted?
I had my thought before I wrote my notes down, so let me get back to you on that.
Okay. Okay, no problem. Happens to me all the time. And I would say liberal Christian movements, most of the Christians with whom, I work hand in glove day and night, recognize this. And they would say, we need, and Catholics, very importantly, because about half of Christians in the world are Catholic. So Catholics will say, we need to read and understand the New Testament in the context of the times in which it was written, rather than, I would say, a more fundamentalist approach would say, it is literally God's word, and we have to accept it verbatim. So you will see a huge difference there. So what are we Jews to make of Christianity? We're going to talk about anti-Semitism next week, particularly Nazi anti-Semitism. And I have a series also on my website of 6 nights when I discussed anti-Semitism. Christians didn't invent anti-Semitism. It existed in Greece and Rome and Egypt, for that matter. And they weren't unique in its practice. There's Muslim anti-Semitism, there's Nazi anti-Semitism, there is Enlightenment anti-Semitism. But Christian anti-Semitism paved the way for the Nazis and the Holocaust. Many Christians hold the only way to heaven is through Jesus. They will come to your door and mine. And I always like to joke, they're sorry when they come to mine because I invite them in. And after, 2 or 3 hours, they're dying to leave because they have 14 more blocks to cover. And I'm having a great old time. I have no problem with Christians trying to convert me to Christianity. In fact, as I understand Christianity, from their perspective, they are trying to do me a favor. And anytime somebody wants to do me a favor, I don't have a problem with that. The only problem is if they try to convert us through force or misleading, force or coercion, as long as it's not misrepresentation. And here, and again, as you read my book, you'll see I have a specific problem with Messianic Judaism or Jews for Jesus, because my understanding of that is that Jews for Jesus will make the argument, what's the big deal? Some Jews are waiting for the Messiah. We're Jews that believe the Messiah came 2,000 years ago and he happened to be a guy named Jesus. What's the big deal? The big deal is not who was Jesus, it's who is God and what does God expect of us. And Christianity, I have no problem with Christianity unless you have a movement that tries to trick Jews into converting without realizing we're converting. And then, of course, quite often, and this is true not only in Jewish-Christian dialogue, but in political dialogue, where it's it's not really a dialogue or a discussion, but it's people screaming at each other, or just the Christians that knock on your door to convert you are not really interested in understanding Judaism and why we cling to Judaism. They're really only interested in us hearing their way. Bryce.
Yeah, so it really comes to a fundamental a schism between Jews and Christians, and that is that we, by existing, are denying their fundamental tenet, and that, we say, hey, just accept that we think you guys were wrong, and we've got our own thing, and we're still waiting. Thank you very much, and we're not really waiting that much, and that's just like a slap in the face to them, and I don't see how they ever get over it, except for a short amount of time.
Yeah, so what I would say is there's actually a slight subtlety that becomes very important in the Middle Ages, and that is that why didn't the Christians just wipe out the Jews when they could? And one answer is the Jews were testifiers to the Hebrew Bible, and we were basically witnesses to the idea that Judaism is an ancient religion. And in the early days of Christianity, they didn't want to seem like a newfangled cult. They wanted the I don't know, other than the Hebrew word kavod, honor of being part of an ancient religion. So the Christian understanding becomes, our goal is not to wipe out Judaism. Our goal is to keep it suppressed and repressed. And that actually also can be true in Islam. Larry.
Thanks. Two things. First off, the one that I didn't write my notes down on and forgot was in part, another reason why Rome changed the Sabbath for them from Friday, Saturday to Sunday is because in that time period, Sunday was more of the day when the majority of people went to their different gods to pray and so forth. So if you're going to try to change a bunch of people, if you can do it in a way that doesn't mess them up so much,
right,
then, and that's in part why that was changed. The other one is, I've had different ministers and so forth talk to me about this, that, and the other. And they say, are you looking for you're looking for a Messiah? And I said, am I looking for a Messiah? No, I'm not looking for a Messiah. I'm looking for a messianic age when humankind grows up and does what I was talking about with Leviticus 19, verse 18 and 34, be responsible for each other.
Mm-hmm.
And then when we grow up, this is the messianic age. And then when God picks someone or appoints someone, a Messiah, if it's your Jesus, I'm fine with that. If it's a Muslim Messiah, I'm fine with that, because that's God's choice.
Yeah, and one of
they
the
get
points,
very confused.
Christians by and large don't understand that Messiah is not at the center of Judaism. There's a rabbinic story that says if you're planting a tree and someone comes and tells you the Messiah has come, finish planting the tree, because there have been lots of false messiahs, and if the Messiah has come, he'll still be there, tomorrow when you finish planting the tree. And I think I noted in my book that there are more pages devoted to Maimonides, a Jewish philosopher. In the Jewish Encyclopedia, there are more pages devoted to Maimonides than to Messiah. Let's see, I think I'm finished with this page. So the key is what we're doing now. And for some of you are part of this group and room because you have some interest in converting to Judaism, but not all of you. There are many people that take my class, I would say half or more than half, that really just want to be more literate in their Judaism. So the key is for Jews to be knowledgeable and secure in their Jewish understanding. I think Jerry Falwell is once quoted as saying he's never converted a knowledgeable Jew. It is unlikely that Judaism will overwhelm Christianity. And I talked about this actually at the end of my discussion of anti-Semitism and why I am fundamentally optimistic. Actually, I think I'm fundamentally optimistic because it's in my DNA. Now, how do I fool myself into being optimistic? It's by using this logic. In the bad old days, Jews, by and large, in many countries in which we live, were given the choice: convert, leave, or die. Basically, convert to the majority religion or culture, leave town. Every nation except the United States that's had a significant population of Jews have expelled their Jews, or we'll put you to death. And leaving typically was pretty hazardous. It wasn't booking a flight on KLM. It was placing all of your worldly possessions in the hands of a ship's captain that might be just as likely to steal them and toss you overboard or leave you on some island. So who stayed Jewish? Individual Jews who, for some strange reason, were obsessed. Now, the mystics would say their souls are Jewish, and there was a connection with God and Shekhinah, and we get to all kinds of Kabbalistic stuff. But for some reason, there were groups of Jews that stayed Jewish in spite of logical, rational teaching that would say, no, just go along with the majority culture. In these good new days, people aren't asking us to convert, leave, or die. They say, relax, assimilate. They don't say, I'm going to kill you. They say, marry me, and have a pepperoni pizza while you're at it. Who's going to remain Jewish? I think it's the same group. It's the group of Jews who, for some reason, have this attachment, deep soul level, not necessarily logical or rational, to their Judaism. For some reason, if you attribute this to God or you're just looking at history, the Jewish people hasn't grown very rapidly. At least when I wrote this slide, I had data on this. I haven't rechecked it recently. About 8 million Jews, around the time of Jesus 2,000 years ago, and about double that today. A doubling time of 2,000 years isn't what you call a spectacular growth rate. Now, Hitler is partially responsible, not partially, largely responsible for that. But we don't seem to be catching on in a world that is much larger. So in closing, I would say I admire and love Christianity. Jews have no desire to convert non-Jews. Judaism is the one true religion for Jews, not for everyone. I prefer that non-Jews be Christian or Muslim or any religion that espouses the golden rule, with the idea that human life is sacred and that you should treat other people the way you want to be treated. I want them to behave. My emphasis is on how they behave, as though the God of Abraham and the God of the Ten Commandments is watching them and will judge them. And if they behave well through a theology that I think is silly, or certainly not my theology, I could care less, as long as it results in a better world. And I use what I just quickly highlight as the dark alley example. You're walking down the proverbial dark alley, darkened street in the worst part of town, and you're more than a little nervous. And then you see in the shadows up ahead of you, like 20 big guys walking toward you. And then they walk under a street light, and you see they're being led by a priest who's wearing a clerical collar, and they're all carrying Bibles. I don't know about you, but I would be relieved. Now, somebody in one of these classes said, well, in the 12th century in Spain, you wouldn't be relieved. And I agree with you. In the 12th century in Spain, I wouldn't be relieved. But now I am. The ethics of Christianity and Islam are virtually identical to the ethics of Judaism. And if the Jewish mission to the world is to bring the message of God, is to bring the world to an acknowledgement and worship of the God of Abraham, then Christians and Muslims are doing the lion's share of the work. In the world we are in today, about half the citizens of the world worship the God of Abraham, and a very small fraction, like 0.2% of the world, count themselves as Jews. I love Christmas, but I love it as an outsider. As a kid, I would always go over to my neighbors' parents, close friends, my close friends' houses to decorate Christmas. I cry at a Christmas Carol. I think It's a Wonderful Life is the most Jewish movie I can think of, but it's certainly not typically thought of as a Jewish movie. I love Christmas music. I've written a whole series of Hanukkah carols, including my infamous "No Oil, No Oil." So I love Christmas, but it's not my holiday. So how do we live in this world? I would say Jews have to remain Jewish. It's not about Hanukkah versus Christmas. Whenever I conduct a bar bat mitzvah, one of my favorite parts of the bar bat mitzvah is when the Torah scroll is handed down from generation to generation. And I love it when I have a great grandparent. And I point out, let's say we have a great grandparent. Okay, Yankel, here's your great grandparent, there's your grandparent, there's your parent. You're the fourth generation. God willing, you'll have children, grandchildren, and even great grandchildren, 7 generations. How many generations since Moses? Just to make the math easy, Moses' time frame for Sinai is about 3,200 years ago. To make the math easy, if I take 32 years as a generation, then it's 100 generations. So you, Yankel, or Leah, are at the center of a chain of 7 generations. It's a pretty good sized chunk of the total. Our job as Jews is to hand off the Torah, like the Olympic torch, to one more generation. Jews should know enough to answer questions of children and friends. Jews must treat non-Jews with respect and demand to be treated likewise. We should strive, I believe, for religion in our lives, but not in our government and its institution. I want people to be religious. I don't want our government institutions to be religious. And we must recognize that most, not all, Southern Baptists being an important example, Christian churches are renouncing their anti-Semitic teachings and the goal of converting Jews. And we should let go of our justified anger at Christians for their historical role in anti-Semitism, assuming that that has changed their outlook. I would say the greatest threat to Jews and Judaism does not come from the Christian world today. I see Christianity as a partner in the redemption of the world, and we have to work on that relationship. We Jews have paid an unbearably horrible price of suffering in the Holocaust. And the result is that the world was shocked into re-examining, certainly the Christian world, its anti-Semitic views, leading to Christian churches renouncing centuries-old teaching. The result is a window of opportunity for discussion, friendship, and I believe even partnership. Is it worth it? I would say absolutely not. That level of murder and destruction and horror is not worth it. But that's not the question we get to ask. The question we get to ask is not, in our personal lives and in our lives as Jews, not why me, why us, why the Jews. The question that is most helpful is what do we do now? So I believe that this is our window. And if we miss it 50 or 100 years from now, the Holocaust will seem like World War I, distant and abstract. And the Holocaust deniers will have their way and will be condemned to repeat the horror. So a couple of important books or some writings. One, I have 2 appendices in my own book. One is Dabru Amet, which means speak truth. And it's a statement by rabbis on Christians and Christianity. And in response, a Christian scholars group wrote a text called The Sacred Obligation. And that's the second appendix of my book. And you can also clearly find them online. There's a lot of good books on this subject. There's a wonderful book called Christianity in Jewish Terms. And basically it takes key religious words and has 3 essays on each, 2 Jewish and 1 Christian. There's a wonderful book, called Opening the Covenant, A Jewish Theology of Christianity, published in 2008. I was ordained in 2003, and my thesis was a little more timid. It was toward a theology of Judaism and Christianity. But Michael Kogan, who's an acclaimed theologian, has actually written a Jewish theology of Christianity, which means the underlying point here, I think, is an important one. We preach tolerance, but tolerance is a very low bar. If my neighbor is really noisy or, or rude and so on, I might tolerate such a person. If I'm sitting in a restaurant and people next to me are smoking, I might tolerate them, but it's a weak praise indeed. I would say to really be partners with other people's, I need to develop a theology and understanding of, if I believe in God and I believe God has something to do with history, then why is it that God put so many Christians and Muslims into the world? And that's what Kogan writes about beautifully. And as suggested by his title, Opening the Covenant, his bottom line approach is, if we really want to have a good chunk of the world worship the God of Abraham, it's probably not going to be through a Jewish vehicle. It's probably going to be through something other. And that's his understanding of Christianity. And then the last book is one that I mentioned earlier, Modern Jews Engage the New Testament, by Rabbi Michael Cook. And it basically, he has a very interesting discussion of looking at the elements of Christianity that are Jewish and the elements of Christianity that are Roman and pagan. And of course, there's a lot more books. A good chunk of what you see behind me is books about Jewish-Christian dialogue. So I am going to stop screen share and open up the discussion for questions, comments, alternative sermons. While I take a drink of water. Marlene.
I'm going to make a comment that it's purely my feeling, doesn't reflect anybody else, but I'm going to say it anyway. A couple slides back where you said that, like, religion shouldn't be in cahoots, in so many words, with the government. With things that have been going on the last 2 years, the government and the Supreme Court has brought religion into government. When it comes to, with COVID, the government is allowing people to get religious exemptions to get vaccinations. The Supreme Court, talking about abortion, is making it a religious thing.
I understand the point.
And it bothers me that that it's become like this.
Okay,
where
so you're absolutely agreeing with me. It bothers me too, but I would say it's not such a simple issue. For example, my guess is that you would agree that Blacks ought to be able to eat at lunch counters and have a right to, to all the goods and services that whites do. Am I correct that that would be your belief?
Yeah, everyone has a right. Yes.
Right. So the idea that Blacks are fully human and all humans are endowed with those rights is a religious idea. It's an idea that we agree with and we adopt. Where things get difficult is where religions sort of split off and have different ideas, and abortion is a great example. And I'll point out that Jewish law on abortion is not pro-abortion. Jewish law on abortion is to allow abortion only when the life of the mother is threatened, and that's understood very broadly to include her emotional health rather than just her physical life. Most Jews that I know would say abortion ought to be a decision between a woman and her doctor and maybe her rabbi. So the question is when there are times when we clearly would allow religious ideas to influence government policy. And I would say human rights. Human rights is a religious idea. But I'm certainly in favor of human rights. It gets difficult in the details. Judaism, specifies the death penalty for adultery. I would not be in favor of the death penalty existing for adultery. So it's not so easy. There are religious exemptions for service in the military. There are religious exemptions for service in the military in the Bible. So it's not easy. Democracy is not easy. And I think we're seeing how perilous it can be. So while I agree with you, I don't think it's simple. I don't think we do have separation of church and state in this country, but it's subject to the governing process. And the governing process is messy and not easy. There's no simple fix, I guess I would say, to this particular problem. Michael.
So exactly on Marlene's point, and kind of just segueing from, what do we do from here? I'm reminded of a news article maybe about a year or two ago of a African from it was South Africa or another country in Africa who I believe grew up Christian but decided to become Jewish. He went through the Jewish rituals, went through as Abraham had done, created a religious school that was focused in Judaism as well. But when he had tried to apply for Aliyah, the highest Supreme Court in Israel had denied and said that there was this person could not be considered a Jew. Is that the type of fear and this is kind of blending in, I guess, with religion and politics, where someone has, trying to become a Jew, yet you have some sort of legal authority that is secular, trying to decide whether this man and the way that this person was.
Okay, so I don't know the particular case, but there's two issues. One is, are you considered, and particularly in Israel, are you considered Jewish according to the rabbis? And then are you eligible for automatic citizenship according to Israeli law? So in the way Israeli law works right now, there's a good half dozen folks in this program that are studying to become Jewish, and they will be they will be converted under either Reform or conservative auspices. They will be considered Jewish by the Reform and the conservative movement. They will not be considered Jewish by the Orthodox movement. They will be eligible for citizenship under the law of return according to the laws of the state of Israel. The way you described that, I'm not familiar with the case, but the way you described it, it sounded like they developed their own program for converting rather than one. The way I think the law of return works, I looked into this a while ago, it has to be in connection with a Jewish community. And so I would say that's ultimately what the Israeli Supreme Court was deciding. And the only other interesting counterexample there are people who are born Jewish and have converted to other religions. According to the laws of Judaism, they are still Jewish. You can get in, but you can't get out. But according to the state of Israel, if you are born Jewish and you actively convert to another religion, you have forfeited your eligibility for Israeli citizenship under the law of return. So, but you're right, there's an issue between Israeli civil law and Jewish law. And in Israel, it's particularly complex because in Israel, there is no such thing. All family law is religious law. So there's no such thing as secular marriage in Israel. you can only be married in a religious institution, which means, and since the only Jewish religious institution in Israel is the Orthodox rabbinate, it means there is no Reform or conservative marriage in Israel. And there's no interfaith marriage in Israel. So typically, Israelis that want to have a Reform ceremony either have to have an Orthodox ceremony and then a Reform ceremony, or they go out of Israel, like to Cyprus, to get married, because the state of Israel recognizes marriages that take place out of Israel. I hope that's helpful. But these are difficult issues. Ryan.
Yes, so I'm actually familiar with the case. I think it was Uganda. And I think the issue is he had converted with a Jewish community in Uganda, and it was a longstanding community. I mean, going back 100 plus years, but that was not recognized as a Jewish community by the Jewish authorities, because there was some question about whether or not, even though they, had their own synagogues and read from a Hebrew prayer book, whether or not that community that was started 100 years ago was considered a quote unquote, I guess, legitimate, I don't know if that's the right term, community for the purposes of Aliyah.
Right. And I'll just point out that the Orthodox rabbinate wouldn't consider my community a legitimate Jewish community, namely a Reform community, but the state of Israel still recognizes the conversions. The issue, I don't know about Uganda, but say in Ethiopia, the issue was whether that community was behaving under Talmudic law or whether they were just under biblical law. So you get into Jewish legal issues, which then can seep into, Jewish civil issues. And, there's an old story, which probably shouldn't be said in Jewish terms, but two things you don't want to know how they're made are law and sausage. And I've never made sausage, but in my old days working in alternative energy, I have lobbied for laws, and it's a horrendous process. Larry,
Yeah, thanks. Just to add to that, going back within the last 20 years, you had the Ashkenazi and Sephardic rabbis, chief rabbis in Israel, that decided that even conversions in North America, even if it's done by 40 Pacific rabbis before this new law came down, was that if any of these rabbis converted and you're moving to Israel, the Orthodoxy, we do not accept you as Jewish, because they're not going by what we've got. They're going by what's going on there. So if you have been converted by one of these 40 rabbis, you're not Jewish. So it changes, in my opinion, by the whims of the Orthodox.
Yeah. So, but they would also say if you're converted by a Reform rabbi, you're not.
Well, they
Jewish.
would, and conservative too, or even Reconstructionists.
So each movement gets to make its own rules. The thing that is annoying, which is even outrageous, is in Israel, only Orthodoxy is recognized. And why is that? When Ben Gurion was putting together a coalition to create the new state of Israel, he had to do something to get the Orthodox behind him. And Orthodox traditionally have not been behind the creation of a state of Israel, because the idea is only the Messiah can create a state of Israel. So to get both the political and religious support of the Orthodox community, Ben Gurion conceded to the Orthodox establishment that they will control Judaism. And I would say that is changing slightly. We have the first government in the history of Israel at the moment that has no Orthodox parties in it, has Arab parties in the government of Israel at the moment, but the coalition has no Orthodox parties. And so we start seeing things like a secular area, or not a secular, but a mixed worship, Reform conservative area of the Western Wall, and so on. So it's changing slowly, but it's a hard change. Larry?
Yeah, there is a Reform rabbi in the Knesset.
Yes, that's right.
I was just watching that a few weeks ago.
Yes. One of my colleagues is a member of the Knesset. That's true. Okay, any other comments? else. If not, see you, some of you on Shabbat, some of you Monday nights. We have a program. If you're interested in, let me know. I still don't know what I'm doing next Monday night. Some of you tomorrow night. And I wish you a good evening. Stay well. You know, like they say at the end of Hill Street Blues, you know, stay safe out there. It's a crazy time. Take care. Thank you.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Thank you.